I'm Mike Hendrickson from O'Reilly Media. Today I'm going to be talking with Joshua Bixby, who is the president and co-founder of Strangeloop. Welcome, Josh.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
Good. So before we get going with some questions, could you take a minute or so to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and a little something about Strangeloop as well?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm not a technologist by education. Spent my formative years working in microfinance in West Africa, working on World Bank sponsored projects, and eventually found and weaved my way in the dot-com era into technology. It was the only place that a young kid could be a CEO, and I don't like working for other people. Founded a few businesses in the content management space, and my customers, well, we were building very large websites, and my customers kept coming back to me and saying, I want them faster. So I decided in my most recent incarnation, which is working at Strangeloop, to fight that battle. Strangeloop is a business. We make websites automatically faster. So we tackle the front-end optimization problem, which, as Steve Souders and others have really highlighted, is where the main performance challenges are in the modern web. We're in the business of serving our customers, people like Visa and eBay and Travelocity and the like, and making their sites automatically faster.
Excellent. So, Josh, thanks for your background and a little bit about Strangeloop. But I'm kind of curious here. What was the inspiration for a somewhat of a strange name like Strangeloop?
It's a really good question. You know, we start out our businesses. This is my third, always with a code name, because we don't want to get too attached to it. At least that was the theory up until Strangeloop came along. And the name comes from a Douglas Hofstadter book, which is called Gödel Bach, and it's about the idea of intelligence. So it's quite complicated, but the concept essentially is self-referential. If you continue to learn and then learn from that learning, there are these self-referential loops that he terms as strange loops, which create education. It's through awareness and education that one learns. And so when we looked at the web performance problem and we looked at automating what's quite a complex problem, the first thing that came to mind to our one of the founders, our current CTO, was this is like a strange loop. We've got to learn, we've got to keep learning, and from that cycle, we will get smarter. We tried to change the name like we always do, so I still have the spreadsheets of hundreds of URLs. And it stuck. People liked it. It was memorable. And I think what's neat about it is it captures the essence of what we're trying to do. Obviously, quite tech, but that's good as well, given who we sell to.
Yes, exactly. So I've seen you talk both in Berlin and Beijing, and you were in your talks. You mentioned that we're in the middle of a couple revolutions. We're in the middle of two revolutions. Can you explain what they are and what they mean to building faster, higher performance websites?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the one that I really was focusing on in my most recent talks has been the mobile revolution. And the idea is that we are, and this is for most people listening who are aware in our community, this doesn't even feel revolutionary, but it is. We're changing the way that we work. We're browsing the internet on our phones. We're buying on our phones. Our phones are becoming an integral part of our consumption. And that is something that we're just right in the middle of. I mean, when you look at the stats, it's remarkable to see the penetration, the growth of smartphones. The numbers that recently came out from Apple are mind-boggling in terms of how many of us are buying and consuming the devices themselves. So there's this fascinating revolution that's happening there. And what's exciting about it is we haven't hit the end. We haven't peaked out. We're right in the middle of it. The other one that we're still in is the internet revolution. I mean, we can't forget that this started, only 15 years ago for most of us, in terms of our general adoption of this. And even that trend, we're just starting to see, this year, the crossing of the lines between e-commerce sales and retail sales, where people are going to buy more online. I mean, we're still in the middle of that. And so I think what's so exciting about this time is that these two trends are coinciding to create this complete change in how we consume. And that brings up an amazing opportunity.
Yeah, I would imagine one of the things about the internet trend itself is that the second generation, or the Web 2, is probably taxing a lot of websites a lot more than the old internet used to.
Yeah.
So I've also heard you talk about the relationships between faster mobile sites and business KPIs. And you draw from a lot of case studies in the mobile area specifically. When did you start to see an institutional need to make better business cases for better performance? And who typically needs to make that case, and to whom?
Wow, that's a great question. So, we have a self-serving need to create business cases. Let's be honest, I sell acceleration. So, putting that aside, which is an issue, given our world, what we saw is at the end of 2010, people were starting to ask questions about the value of mobile. And they were starting to, the early adopters had adopted, and people were starting to try to figure out how important it was and how much money to spend, which is really where the business case comes out of. So we started to see it in 2010, but to be honest, the year of 2011, although prognosticated to be the year of mobile from the perspective of a customer and website, really wasn't. I mean, most of our customers at, in early 2011 and mid 2011 were still making under 2% of their revenue through the mobile channel. It was interesting, it was sexy, but it really didn't move the bottom line. I think it's only at the end of 2011, as we start steaming into 2012, where we saw a really significant shift. I mean, at the end of 2011, our customers were starting to earn 7, 8, 9% of their revenue through their web properties on mobile devices. And I think when that starts to become meaningful for my customers in that range, especially with that growth curve. So I would argue that, from an ROI perspective, the business case, it was intriguing in the beginning of 2011. It became business critical at the end. And I'd argue we're just at that flashpoint. I mean, January, early February, this is on the agenda of the senior roundtables in the large companies today across a mass adoption. I mean, obviously guys like Facebook and Twitter have been seeing this for 2 years, but when you look at the mortal companies, their worlds are a bit different.
So, one thing too that I think a lot of people need to consider is not only their mobile site, which could be a .m site, but their full website and their app and how they all integrate and work together. So how do you come up with some general rules of thumb for comparing your company's performance all combined so that you're looking at apples versus apples?
Yeah, that's, my customers are struggling with that today. So, one of the things I think that's difficult is that people today think of them as 3 separate platforms and measure them by different metrics. And I think that's a real problem. I mean, ultimately, if, for example, you're an e-commerce shop, what matters is, brand matters. So exposure, page views, things of that nature. But what really matters to a lot of my customers is how much money they make. And so it's an easy calculation to figure out how much you made on your mobile website, m.site, how much you made on your full site. Any analytics tool can break that out, and how much you made on an app, back-end systems can usually help you with that as well. So for me, I want to anchor people around not how cool the platforms are and how nice it is to have an app in the App Store, although that does feed ego. The reality is we've got to step back, and the business hasn't changed. Even though I'm on a mobile platform, the business hasn't changed. The business KPIs are identical today as they were before mobile was there. Companies care about brand and concepts like bounce rate and page views, and they care about revenue. And we're also seeing, a large influx of organizations caring about things like productivity on applications that aren't necessarily measured through e-commerce, normal e-commerce metrics. But if you're thinking e-commerce and really focused, it's about how much money you make. And I think it's pretty simple. Now, there are a lot of tools out there to figure out, speed and get apples to apples comparisons. I mean, one of the main tenets of our assumption base going into this is that apps are not appropriate for most organizations. And that being said, we are really seeing that come to fruition this year, where organizations are abandoning this idea that I'm going to have 1,000 apps for every store I go to. The app on a phone or on a tablet is called the browser, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many customers. So I think we're going to move. I think this is a flash in the pan, this idea of I'm going to have a mobile site and a desktop site and the app. I think we're going to look at that as archaic. We're going to look at that in the same way as we looked at why I used to have Microsoft Word on my desktop, although frankly I still do. But we're going to be looking at that era and say that era of desktop software really is a bygone era. I mean, in fact, I was on my wife's computer yesterday and I actually had a program that installed. I had an installer. And I'm thinking, I haven't seen an installer for a year. I don't install software anymore. Everything's in the cloud. And we're going to see this idea, I think, on the devices and the tablets. So, roundabout way, but I think that apples to apples is easy as long as you don't forget what your business is. And I'm still seeing people forget what their business is.
Okay, well, so apples and apples, and I've also learned through years of experience that there typically are about 4 variables. I'm going to add 5 in this case here. In software engineering, when people are building their website and maybe they have the goal to get a high-performance website, you can typically trade off time, cost, quality, and scope. Now, if you throw in the 5th variable being performance, and you think about building a website that's really optimized for performance, how would you rank these 5 variables in most important to least important, and why?
Oh, that's a great question. And wow, do I ever have a biased opinion? I've said this, but more parroting others. I think performance and cost are in the top 2. And I don't think you can necessarily play one off the other, because there's diminishing marginal rates of return on performance, as there certainly are, and cost is obviously central. So those 2 for me, everything else is below that. I think from a functionality perspective and a feature perspective, all of that defers to performance. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I see organizations come out with a fancy new website that is beautiful and looks great and has lots of functionality, but it's so slow they lose large percentage of their viewers. And I just can't, Fred Wilson and others have just really hammered home this idea, which I am a huge supporter of, that there is only one feature that's important, and it's speed, and everything else is if it's not fast, it's a bug. It's not something you trade off. And so, for me, performance and cost are up there. The other 3, I'm going to put all in a similar bucket that defer to those 2.
Okay. Excellent. So, related in quality and scope and time, in your experience, what is the most common cause of mobile users not staying on a website or not purchasing? Is it the same thing, or are there a couple different variables in there that affect mobile users not staying on?
We've seen a few variables. So, I mean, it's very difficult for me so if I carve out usability and functionality, which is really a world that I think is, although it's not artistic anymore, that's quite scientific. If I take that out and say, all of that being equal, I definitely see that, we just did a recent study that we talked about in Berlin and Beijing, where we saw where people made money and how they flowed through a site. One of the things that I found was astounding about that was that 1/3 of users wanted the full functionality of the site. They didn't want an M-dot site, a small mobile site that had constrained functionality. So for me, one of the big determining factors that I saw in the studies that I've done is around the fact that people want the full functionality, the full breadth of feature set, especially when you're talking about pads, tablets, and things of that nature. So for me, functionality, but from the perspective of offering just the tools that we're used to and the navigational flows that we're used to, I think is one thing. Performance, obviously we saw the correlation and it was significant. I mean, we're talking about 1 second delays changing conversion by 5, 6, 7%. That, based on my experience with websites where I walk in and give customers the ability to make their sites faster, I constantly hear this was better than any usability improvement we made all year. This speed improvement made a bigger difference on my key metrics than anything I've done, even collectively in the same year. So I have heard that enough. Obviously, I want to hear that, but I've heard that enough that I believe access to full featured functionality and speed are 2 variables that I have seen with my own eyes quantified directly back to performance. Now, or back to the, the KPIs, customer care. Now, I'm not doing, change that banner from green to blue. That's not my area of expertise. I'm convinced that those psychological usability effects also have an important, place in this world, but it's not an area that I spend a lot of my time.
Okay. So can you give a couple examples of some of the companies you worked with, without giving their names, that have experienced dramatic improvements in their KPIs, such as page views or conversions or revenue?
Sure.
The companies that have actually optimized and see a difference.
So I can give you some examples that sit in different spaces, because I think it's interesting to hear the different types of examples that are out there. And, these are examples that apply to me as well as they'd apply to anyone that have improved speed. So I don't want this to be this isn't about Strangeloop, but for me, it's about customers that have made the decision to invest, whether themselves or, by doing it themselves or through automation, and the benefits they've brought and the benefits that have brought to them. So one of the case studies that we did on the mobile front recently was with a very large organization, $3 billion in revenue. They have stores online, or big major stores online, major retail stores. So quite a hybrid model. They are an interesting customer because their demographic is sort of higher end. Purchases are in the $100 to $150 range on average. Their demographic is primarily women older than 50 who are buying on these types of sites. And what this customer, and what's interesting about them is we did, instead of speeding them up necessarily, in this case, we slowed them down to take a look at the opportunity to really quantify what the value was. So in this particular case, we slowed them down. We saw that a 1 second delay resulted in 5% revenue improvement. And then obviously we quickly sped them up after, because they saw the benefit and they wanted to see what that value actually meant. What we found is, through the speeding up process, we went well beyond that 1 second. And we found a few really interesting things. We found obviously that conversion and page views went up dramatically. In this case, by almost 2x in the case of page views, for example, for this organization. One of the things that was really interesting was the smoothing of the curve. So what we found as we accelerated was that they lost, from a bounce rate perspective, they lost many fewer visitors who came, saw that white screen, and decided to go somewhere else. And so not only did it make a difference at from the end of the funnel in terms of conversion, we also saw a really significant difference at the beginning of the funnel, which was related to bounce rate. And then, interestingly enough, from my perspective, we saw a significant difference for those return visitors. So it's about all of those different pieces. Now, we also looked at another organization that had just launched an app. It was internal. And internal in the sense that you had to log in, and it was a process. You had to go from point A to point B to point C. What was interesting about this customer is that they could tie to every task that was completed online a dollar figure. They knew that it cost them $200 less to do it online than it took to do it over the phone or in person. So for them, there was a clear economic incentive to have people complete the task. So that was another really interesting example where we applied the automation of speed, and we saw that we could bring bounce. For every 10 people that started the transaction, we could keep 2 or 3 more if we applied speed to the problem. And what was great about that example, and we're starting to see more and more on the productivity side, is that we can start seeing how dollar figures can be tied directly to the end user experience, right? If 20% or 30% more people complete and each person's worth $200, you can start seeing the effect on the business. So we're seeing some really interesting examples in the e-commerce space, in the ad-driven space, and in the productivity or internal space that really make me believe that performance is a bit of a universal cure. And is a, performance equals revenue, no matter how you calculate it.
Excellent. So when you think about velocity and, the conference that we have and what it embodies, performance and web optimization and web ops, when you think about it on a worldwide scale, what do you think is the most significant effect of performance on key business metrics and KPIs? I mean, more than just one answer, like, it speeds things up, it makes you better.
Yeah.
What is the real significant effect that performance can have on a company?
Well, it's an interesting question. I was at a meeting last week with an organization that is at the world's forefront of performance. And what I noticed from a cultural perspective was, a couple really interesting things that aren't, the stock answer of it equals revenue and it equals, because I think those things are obviously what drive a business. What I found fascinating when I go into cultures where performance is the feature, where isn't a feature, but it is the product, is an attention to the customer need. And so what I thought was really interesting is as I start immersing myself in both velocity culture, which, as I'm a huge fan of, but also in the cultures of companies that have adopted an ethos where, ops and development speak and network speaks to them and they're all fighting the same goal. It feels like they're all in the same lifeboat. And these cultures are ones where I'm seeing a transformation. And whether performance is, whether this is causation or spurious causation, I don't know, but I'm definitely seeing that performance is bringing people together and making them focus on what the customer wants, thinking from a customer perspective. I mean, if you rewind 5 years ago, before the work Steve did and Stoyan and all the guys that are pioneers in this field, everyone thought of performance as when it left the door, right? Beyond that, that's not my problem. If you have a slow network, a slow router, a slow modem, that's your problem, not mine. People now, I feel, are taking accountability for delivery of the real product, which is the website to someone's browser. And I'm seeing that infiltrate other parts of the culture where they're now taking responsibility beyond the outside of the gates of their organization. So long-winded way to say, I think that the performance ethos is really an ethos of putting customers first and thinking from a customer perspective, because that's really what's changed in our business. Sites don't take 1 second to load, because they don't. And we have to think as a customer. And I'm seeing repercussions, whether it's customer-centric thinking due to performance or performance as part of customer-centric thinking, whatever the causation, I just think it's wonderful that I'm walking into organizations that are thinking about how their customers experience the brand. And that for me is the transformative aspect of it. Beyond the fact that it saves you money and, makes you money, beyond all of that, that's the one that really drives me.
And this also ties right back to your original statement about the two revolutions, and the one that seems to be key right now is mobile, where there are more customers than ever because there are more mobile users than ever, and their bandwidth may be more limited and need more help from the companies.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I hope we see you in Santa Clara. I think it's June this year.
Of course. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I'm actually speaking in Paris the day before, and I've asked the organizers to move it up early in the day so I won't miss any of Velocity. So I'm taking a red-eye flight back from Paris so that I don't miss anything. Thank you so much. Take care, Mike.